Hello Year 12s and welcome to this video on the 1967 referendum about Australia's First Nations people. There are three things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video to take notes. Use the rewind function if you need to go over any information contained in this video. And the third thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching this video, please make sure that you read the sections from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Well, let's get started then. On this slide, I've set out the learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should be able to do two things. First, you should be able to explain the significance of the 1967 referendum about Australia's First Nations people. Second, you should be able to discuss the ability of the Australian people to change the Australian Constitution, including in relation to past and future constitutional reform. We will be using the 1967 referendum about Australia's First Nations people to support points you could make in this discussion. We will also be using the unsuccessful 2023 voice referendum, which is the subject of another video, to support points you could make in this discussion. So this video about the 1967 referendum and the other video about the 2023 voice referendum complement each other. The 1967 referendum is an example of a successful referendum because the changes to the Constitution that were proposed in that referendum were approved by the Australian people in accordance with the double majority requirement. This means that voting at the referendum satisfied both limbs of the double majority requirement. First, the referendum proposal was approved by the majority of all voters in Australia. Second, the referendum proposal was approved by a majority of voters in the majority of states. Put another way, the 1967 referendum is an example of how the Australian people can change the Australian Constitution. In particular, the 1967 referendum illustrates some of the factors that are necessary for a referendum to be successful. So that you can explain the significance of the 1967 referendum, we must first look at the position before the Constitution was changed by this referendum, and then look at the position after the Constitution was changed by this referendum. Make sure you include the description on this slide in your summary books. Before the 1967 referendum, Section 51(26) of the Constitution stated that the Commonwealth Parliament had the power to make laws about the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race. This meant that only the state parliaments, not the Commonwealth Parliament, had the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people. Put another way, the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people was a residual lawmaking power. As a result of the referendum, Section 51(26) was amended to give the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people. This meant that after this referendum, both the Commonwealth Parliament and the state parliaments, not just the state parliaments, could now make laws about Australia's First Nations people. In other words, the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people ceased to be a residual lawmaking power and became a concurrent lawmaking power. The 1967 referendum also made another significant change to the Constitution. This was to repeal, that is, to delete, Section 127 of the Constitution. Section 127 stated that the Aboriginal people were not to be included when calculating Australia's population. The removal of Section 127 meant that, since 1967, Aboriginal people have been included when calculating Australia's population, for example, in the National Census. Now, don't make the mistake that many students make. The 1967 referendum did not give Australia's First Nations people the power to vote. It had nothing to do with voting by Australia's First Nations people. Well, now that you understand what the 1967 referendum did, you can see that this referendum is an example of how the Australian people can change the Constitution. In the 1967 referendum, the Australian people changed the Constitution so that the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people ceased to be a residual lawmaking power and became a concurrent lawmaking power, and so as to include Australia's First Nations people in the calculation of the Australian population. The 1967 referendum is significant for the three reasons described in the table on this slide and the next two slides. Make sure that you include a copy of this table in your summary books. First, the 1967 referendum changed the division of lawmaking powers between the Commonwealth Parliament and the state parliaments by changing the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people from a residual lawmaking power, that is, a lawmaking power that can only be exercised by the state parliaments, to a concurrent lawmaking power, that is, a lawmaking power that can be exercised by both the Commonwealth Parliament and the state parliaments. This had two consequences. The first consequence was to increase the Commonwealth Parliament's lawmaking powers because the referendum gave the Commonwealth Parliament a new lawmaking power, that is, the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people. The second consequence was to decrease the state parliament's lawmaking powers. This is because of the operation of Section 109. Because the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people is now a concurrent lawmaking power, if the Commonwealth Parliament makes a law about Australia's First Nations people, and a state parliament also makes a law about Australia's First Nations people, and those laws are inconsistent, then the Commonwealth law will override the state law to the extent of that inconsistency. This effectively decreases the state parliament's lawmaking powers. Before the referendum, only the state parliaments could make laws about Australia's First Nations people. But now, after the referendum, any laws that the state parliaments make about Australia's First Nations people can be overridden by an inconsistent Commonwealth law. In summary, one reason the 1967 referendum is significant is because it increased the Commonwealth Parliament's power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people at the expense of the state parliament's powers to make laws about Australia's First Nations people. The Commonwealth Parliament has exercised this lawmaking power in two main ways. First, it has used this lawmaking power to override state laws that discriminate against Australia's First Nations people, such as Queensland laws which restricted the rights of Indigenous people to own land. Second, the Commonwealth Parliament has used this lawmaking power to make laws for the benefit of Australia's First Nations people. For example, the Commonwealth Parliament was exercising this lawmaking power when it made the Native Title Act 1993, which recognises and regulates native title. Native title is an interest that Indigenous people have in land which enables them to use the land in the way their ancestors used the land before white settlement. The The Commonwealth Parliament has also exercised this lawmaking power to make laws under which the Commonwealth Government provides financial assistance to Australia's First Nations people, for example, to assist them to obtain proper health care and education. The second reason the 1967 referendum is significant is that it illustrates some of the factors that are necessary for a referendum to be successful. There have been 45 referendums to change the Constitution since Federation in 1901, but only 8 of those referendums have been successful. Because the 1967 referendum is one of those 8, it is a very good example of the factors that are necessary for a referendum to be successful. In fact, the 1967 referendum is the most successful referendum in Australia's history, in the sense that it was approved by the biggest ever majorities. Specifically, the first limb of the double majority requirement was satisfied by 90.77% of all Australian voters approving the referendum proposal, which is the highest yes vote of any referendum we have had. And the second limb of the double majority requirement was satisfied by the majority of voters in all of the 6 states, not just the majority of voters in 4 out of the 6 states approving the referendum proposal, with this vote varying from 80.95% of voters in Western Australia supporting the referendum proposal to 94.68% of voters in Victoria supporting the referendum proposal. There were 3 key factors that contributed to the success of the 1967 referendum. First, the proposal to change the Constitution so as to give the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws about Australia's First Nations people and to include Australia's First Nations people in the calculation of Australia's population had bipartisan support. That is, both the government and the opposition supported this change. Indeed, the Commonwealth Parliament passed the bill to change the Constitution unanimously. That is, all the members of the Commonwealth Parliament voted in favour of the bill. And the explanatory booklet sent to each Australian household by the Australian Electoral Commission contained no case, because the referendum proposal was supported by all of the political parties in the Commonwealth Parliament. As a result, voters were much more likely to vote in favour of the change because the party that they generally voted for supported the change. Second, the proposal that the Australian people were voting on was simple and clear. It was not complex, but it was easily understood. In essence, the Australian people were voting on whether or not to change parts of the Constitution that discriminated against Australia's First Nations people, specifically Section 5126, which only allowed the state parliaments to make laws for Australia's First Nations people, and Section 127, which prevented Australia's First Nations people from being included when calculating Australia's population. Third, the referendum proposal had significant support within the community. In fact, the referendum proposal was largely driven and promoted by a grassroots campaign within the community that included both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. This reflected the general community view that it was no longer acceptable to discriminate against Australia's First Nations people. The third reason the 1967 referendum is significant is that it promoted reconciliation with Australia's First Nations people by repealing racially discriminatory provisions of the Constitution and recognising Australia's First Nations people as part of the Australian population. The repeal of Section 127 and the consequent recognition and inclusion of Australia's First Nations people in the national census was also intended to improve governmental decision-making by enabling the Commonwealth Government to make informed decisions about policies that impact on Australia's First Nations people. Well, this brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. First, you should be able to explain the significance of the 1967 referendum about Australia's First Nations people. Second, you should be able to discuss the ability of the Australian people to change the Australian Constitution, including in relation to past and future constitutional reform. Now, don't forget to read the sections from the textbook referred to on the first slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, make sure that you supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Thank you for your attention.